Halcyon by Doug Wu. Part 1. Hollow Bodies and Their Convictions. Years ago, the city had been known as a wintry retreat, nestled in the continent's mountainous heartland. The peaks erupted skyward into rocky palisades, corralling the lively city. Tourists bustled in the streets and painted the chalet architecture with dancing shadows. No night was ever quiet, the murmurs of happy wanderlust persisting long past dusk. Come wintertime, snow dusted the skyline with a brush of white, frosting the jovial atmosphere. In those days, the city was picturesque, a scene of peace and natural beauty. Now, the cackle of gunfire was heard above all else. Missile launchers dotted the ridgeline, often illuminating the sky with the fiery tails of rockets. The shingled roofs were blown into piles of rubble by barrages of artillery fire. Little stood resolute. Only a few buildings, concrete megaliths crowned with arrays of telecommunications apparatus, whose figures stood out long before the war, towered above the sea of splintered wood and pulverized brick. Nature tried to throw a blanket of white over the carnage wrought, over the blood and oil slicks, but the snow seldom stuck, melted and dispersed by endless fires and tanks forging through. From the cliffs, the city looked dead and gray, a skeleton of a forgotten past. Skirmishes persisted in the streets. Squads of soldiers hunkered down behind the carcasses of shops and homes, taking shelter from the rain of lead they carved through each alleyway. One group had their backs against the last bricks of what had once been a street corner restaurant, only deducible from the scuffed engraving on a sign, dangling from one chain. There were 10 of them, all cloaked in identical gray uniforms, though each adorned with mismatched patches and insignia. They were a unit thrown together in the chaos of the assault, a group of stragglers following the first glimpse of authority they'd laid their eyes upon. The man nearest the corner, their leader, peered down the cobblestone junction, only to jerk back as a bullet flung a rocky shard across his cheek. He shuffled back to the others, stopping in front of a ghastly soldier propped up against the wall. In the cold, the soldier breathed labored wisps that disappeared into the thin mountain air. Hey, Raff. The leader shook the soldier. His hand was firm, but gentle, pulling the soldier's glazed eyes to his. You got nicked, boss. Raff slurred. He tried to gesture at the leader's face, but his wrist only hovered inches off the ground. The leader still touched his own cheek and felt the wetness that ran red on his glove. He smudged it across his chest, bloodying the embroidered surname Kruger above his chest pocket. I'll be fine. Smoke? Yeah. Kruger reached into Raff's chest pocket and retrieved a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He pulled the last one from the soggy box and helped the injured man bring it to his lips. Raff could barely pinch the cigarette between his gloved fingers. They went limp as soon as he lodged the stick into the corner of his mouth. In the blizzard, Kruger's shivering hands strained to strike and shield a match until Raff could puff a shaky drag. Still with me? Kruger asked. Yeah, I ain't going anywhere. Raff's words were forced, scarcely more than a mumble. Kruger looked him up and down. He was disheveled, hair matted and helmet lost. Raff's pack had been removed. His uniform was damp, grungy from stumbling through slushed craters, and a large blood stain emanated from a hole in the soggy fabric. Kruger eyed the spot before he sighed and gave Raff a pat on the shoulder. Good. Kruger turned to see another soldier sidling up, extending to him the receiver of a satellite phone. He took it and listened, before whistling to call the others to attention. Their heads snapped up and Kruger issued his orders. With only a gesture, he split the group, sending the 5 soldiers to Raff's right shuffling towards the street corner. Kruger grabbed the soldier nearest Raff and pulled his face close. You do not leave his side. Got it? Kruger pointed to Raff, whose eyes now stared far beyond the rubble across the street. As the soldier nodded, a lock of dull blonde hair slid from beneath his helmet. Kruger memorized the alphanumeric label inscribed on the soldier's frosted chest patch before tossing the earpiece back to the radio operator and joining the first team. The weather worsened. The few flurries turned to a dogged and heavy snowfall that formed curtains of slush even before it hit the ground. Kruger glanced back at Raff, his figure rapidly being enveloped by the icy blanket. The other soldiers were statues, not moving even to wipe snow from their weapons. Kruger could barely distinguish the outline of the soldier to whom he'd issued his final command. With a slight forward hand signal from their commander, the squad curled past the corner under the white cloak cascading down around them. Swirling winds drowned out the gunfire. Kruger found Raff's body where he'd left him, an unmistakably human shape buried in 6 inches of snow, still propped against a crumbled brick wall. Even with the snow brushed aside, the dead man was still pale as the powder that had entombed him. Eyes and mouth frozen shut, expressionless. The corpsman took him away soon after. That was the last Kruger ever saw of his friend. The fighting had relented. Now, the only sounds were sparse, occasional pops of small arms fire far away from the occupied city center. The thunder of artillery and the screams of rockets had since subsided in the night. Amidst the blizzard, battered and worn, the enemy had retreated to the outskirts, some even fleeing into the mountains. Though the dawn brought a welcome silence, it wouldn't last. Maybe a day, maybe 2 or 3, maybe even a week. Ultimately, the clash would resume. New orders would come. Nonetheless, all who could welcomed the respite. Helmet in one hand and a small electronic tablet in the other, Kruger wandered through the bustling action at the old city center. Snow, down by the wind from the city ruins, frosted his dark brown hair. The storm had not been kind to the wounded, leaving more black bags than bandaged men. Tents and barricades had been erected, along with several watch posts sporting guards armed with heavy machine guns. They stood above the flattened buildings, as if to mock the rubble's decrepitude. Beneath the posts stood lines of soldiers, held at attention in full combat garb, maintaining an unwavering gaze beyond the horizon. They appeared plasticine, toy-like. Mimics. Though they appeared human enough, their skin elastic to the touch, their blood red when it ran, mimics, biomechanical and biocomputational masterpieces grown or fabricated in some method beyond the layman's comprehension, provided the bulk of the military forces. The soldiers who fought this war weren't human at all, save for those who were. Kruger had fought since the mimics were introduced, 8 years prior, when the military's numbers had been decimated to a quantity incapable of defense. When the nation's protection was no longer sustainable by human means, it was augmented by the inhuman. Since then, Kruger had fought alongside them, providing a uniquely human command to his men. Kruger checked his tablet. The manifest indicated that the object of his search was hidden in the lines. He strolled through each row, reading the chest patches of every mimic until he found the tag he was looking for. I-L1A. I model. ID. L1A. Request debrief on previous operation. Operator. Kruger, J. Full user permissions. The mimic blinked before its gaze aligned with Kruger's. Granted. Follow me. Need a place to write. Kruger set off from the formation with the mimic soldier trailing 2 steps behind. The mimic followed with a rigid gait, stiff and graceless, plodding through the slush. Right, sir? Yeah, a letter, Kruger responded. Writing is not one of this unit's duties. Protocol dictates that users do not employ units for tasks they are not approved for. Its words were cold, but soft, like fresh snowfall. You're not writing. I am. Understood. The mimic continued behind Kruger as he ducked into one of the many olive-drab tents at the staging ground's core. Inside stood vacant benches and tables, a makeshift mess hall, obtusely built to feed far more mouths than it would ever have to. Kruger motioned to a bench as he rounded the opposite side of its table. He set down his tablet, and removed a crumpled paper and a slender ballpoint pen from his jacket. The mimic also sat, its face still concealed by a black helmet and combat goggles. I ordered you not to leave him. Kruger's voice was gravelly and stern, its tone issuing a reprimand before the words of one could be uttered. Leave who, sir? Rafferty, the man who got hit in Grid 2B yesterday afternoon. A superior ordered this unit be redirected toward more immediate matters, sir. Kruger massaged his square, stubbled jaw. The days succeeding a hard-fought battle permitted some deviation from the usual sharp presentation. More immediate matters. Kruger leaned across the table, placing one hand on top of the blank paper and using the other to prod at his temple. Did he say anything before he went? The mimic waited, as if trying to recall the memory. He said he was sorry he couldn't keep his promise. Kruger nodded. That sounds like him. Was this Rafferty important? This unit understands he was not a superior, nor a mission-specific VIP. He was a good friend. Kruger bit his lip. During his years of combat, he'd seen many things. Countless soldiers felled, human and mimic. Many atrocities committed in the heat of battle. Many whom he'd considered friends obliterated and lost to the flames of war. That was his reality. For nearly all of it, Raff had shared in Kruger's suffering, and together they bore the anguish each day brought. Now, tramping through the snowy streets, even with the din of action all around him, Kruger had never felt so alone. You wouldn't understand that. Saying nothing, the mimic stared through Kruger with hidden eyes. For a moment, Kruger wondered if the mimic could comprehend concepts like friends and companionship, but quickly dismissed the notion. Kruger continued. In the shit, surrounded by all you hollow bodies, Donnie Rafferty was the most human thing I'd see each day. The definition of the word human applies to all members of the species Homo sapiens, of which there are several in the immediate vicinity, the mimic unhesitatingly replied in its dry, unwavering tone. To refer to this man as the most human thing is hyperbole, sir. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, sir? This time the mimic slightly cocked its head to the side, punctuating its question. For the most part, mimics showed few signs of emotions or individuality, though it wasn't unheard of for their uniform behavior to waver, ever so slightly. A small inconsistency. What startled Kruger was the inquisitiveness and audacity of this one, the degree of which he'd never seen before. An anomaly. Such anomalous units were supposed to be detected and reconditioned long before an operator would interface with them. Kruger wrapped his middle and index fingers on his forehead. You like to talk. This unit's purpose is for surveillance and espionage. It is only natural that this unit asks questions appropriate for the situation, sir. Only natural, huh? Kruger's hand stroked his stubble once more. Take off that helmet. This is no way to have a conversation. The mimic unclipped its chin strap and pushed off its headgear. A mess of muted yellow fell away as the helmet and goggles were set on the table. The mimic's face was pale and feminine, with a sharp chin and green eyes that did not sparkle, but were cold, dark spheres of unpolished jade. Kruger couldn't help but think this mimic would be considered beautiful if it were mistaken as human. All right, let's talk. Do you have a name? And I'm not calling you a bunch of letters. Would feel too much like barking orders. He glanced down at the tag above the mimic's chest pocket. Ilya. It's easy enough. You got any problems with that? Even if this unit has objections, by protocol, they are secondary to the operator's commands. Fuck protocol. What do you think? Do you have a problem with the name? Kruger pressed. Silence settled in the tent. The mimic moved its mouth, just briefly, before reconsidering. Kruger waited, his chin resting atop steepled hands. No, this unit has no problems. Good. Kruger bent as far back as he could without falling off the bench. Ilya, a trolley is barreling down the tracks, out of control. Ahead, 3 people are tied down to the tracks, unable to move. You're standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley down another route. However, 1 man is tied down there as well. What do you do? Divert the trolley. Ilya's response was immediate, and as full of confidence as the mimic's voice could convey. Explain. Logic dictates that the best solution is the choice that will result in minimal loss of life. Kruger leaned back to the table, towards Ilya. You killed a man. 1 is fewer than 3. True. Kruger nodded. But you pulled the lever. You diverted the trolley. You interfered and became an active participant in that man's death. The outcome is unchanged. And what if the trolley doesn't stop and the same dilemma is presented again, 1 versus 3? Kruger pushed on. Do you still pull the lever? Yes. And again? Yes. Once more, you've now killed 3 people. Do you still pull the lever? Kruger stood, having slammed his fist on the tabletop. Punctuating the final question, his voice had almost risen to a shout. A lone soldier polishing utensils glanced at them before resuming his work. Kruger took a deep breath, regaining his composure. Do you still pull the lever? Ilya paused, still trying to process the question. This unit doesn't. You mimics have no agency. You're dictated by logic and outcomes, numbers and conditioning. You operate in immediacy and don't understand anything else. Kruger's face softened. He remembered even Raph, the man who so often posited the exact dilemma to any unfortunate rookie who made the mistake of stumbling across his path. The man who was most sincere in his absolute humanity, had neither given nor expressed a straight answer of his own. From one day to the next, the same man who Kruger often found playing with the local kids off base became a fixture at the head of a charge, barreling through alleyways, his eyes fixed in a predatory glare. Silently, Kruger basked in the incomprehensibility of it all. This unit doesn't understand. Ilya spoke, meek and uncertain. The mimic's voice quavered as it enunciated each word. You don't understand, Kruger chuckled, running a hand through his wires of hair. That acknowledgement makes you more human than most. Part 2. Man and its devices. 8 years. 8 years of fighting. In the time spent trudging through deserts and forests and cities sapped of their respective liveliness, it was easy for Kruger to forget many things. Many little things. Many orders, many places. They had all disappeared, quickly put behind in the lockstep of combat. Kruger had even forgotten the cause, the spark that ignited the nation into turmoil. He had forgotten the desiccation of the farmland country to the south, or the diminishing manufacturing of the industrial sovereign to the north. He had forgotten the day that the frustrations of his motherland's neighbors spilled across their borders into open conflict. Caught in the middle of two desperate belligerents, the sovereignty of Kruger's small technological home came under threat. A younger Kruger, wrapped in the flag of pride and duty, threw himself into the fray, ignorant to the weight the years would coerce him to bear. That Kruger wasn't prepared for the devastation the scorched earth wrought behind armies. He wasn't prepared for the loss of friends and comrades by his side, nor was he prepared for the mimics that replaced them, and then marched, unflinching to their own destruction, on the battlefield. Kruger couldn't stand the haze of the past, the memories lost and smeared into a blurry stain. Only the needles of pain and grief could pierce the fog, and the heft of time drove them deep into Kruger's mind. But he steeled himself to them. It was an oft grim and lonely task, being a human soldier in an army of dolls. There were few who shared the same struggle. "You're kind of like them, boss," Raph once told him over a glass of 40-year-old scotch they had scrounged from some liberated rubble. The clean-shaven soldier fidgeted with a smoldering cigarette pinched in his free hand. "You got this face that shows nothing. It's uncanny. Makes me wonder if it's fake, if there's actually something hiding behind it. You follow your orders, you do your duty," Raph continued. "In the end, though, it's all just a mask, right? You don't have to take it off for me to see the cracks." Raph motioned to the mimic soldier standing at attention a mere 10 feet away. "Look at that. Our model. New type. 250 pounds of pure technological supremacy. Lucky bastard's got no friends, no family. No mask either. Sure, it remembers shit, but it don't know what to do with that." He swirled the golden liquor before he brought the glass to his lips. "If it ever figured out, if it ever told someone the same shit we tell each other, well, we just tap a few buttons and poof, that head's empty again, good as new." With their bodies lit only by a flickering lamp and Raph's smoldering cigarette, the two soldiers drank silently in the night. Raph finished his drink first and tossed the empty glass over his shoulder. It shattered in the black behind him. "They don't have a single worry in the whole damn world. It's almost like you admire that," Kruger said, downing the last of his scotch before setting the glass down on a rock beside him. "Nah, that would make me something I ain't." "What?" Raph stood and took a long drag from his cigarette before flicking the glowing filter into the darkness. "Inhuman." Like clockwork, Kruger found himself again amidst the chaos. He hunkered down in the atrium of one of the towers which, in peacetime, had loomed over the homely roofs. Its concrete walls and narrow windows that resembled medieval archer slits now blended in with the mounds of debris. It was a vestigial appendage from a different time. The men in the floors above refused to give up ground. Having disabled the elevators and blocked many paths of ascent, they had left only a single stairwell. This route would surely be treacherous and heavily defended, perhaps even a trap, but it was the only way. Kruger's assault unit had taken casualties. His original 20 had been reduced to 7, then augmented by 3 in the rush to the tower. Even after reporting the number of his depleted ranks, the order still came to press on. 4 of Kruger's mimics entered the stairwell first, rifles raised, searching for any signs of movement. The absence of gunshots prompted the remaining 6, including Kruger, to begin the climb behind them. Kruger followed the one with a tuft of blonde hair poking out from its helmet. He was certain it was Ilya. Nearly 40 feet separated the ground and first floors. All 10 of Kruger's mimics had entered the shaft before the first group reached the next level. The door closed, its latch echoing through the shaft, which spanned the height of the building. At that sound, the gunfire commenced. A torrent of bullets rained down on the ascending soldiers. The unlucky vanguard found themselves caught in the open, without the protection of the walls and stairs above them. The others pressed themselves against the sides of the stairwell, beginning a hasty, scrambling retreat. Suddenly came the low clang of metal on metal, repeating and growing closer. Kruger recognized the sound. His intuition confirmed when the small, round objects jumped into view. Grenades. "Ilya!" The soldiers tried to scatter, but were trapped in the confines of the stairwell. Kruger reacted faster, grabbing the mimic in front of him and pulling it down the stairs. He fell for a flight, crashing into the metal banister before the explosion above threw him airborne and down to the ground floor. Kruger tumbled into the stairwell door before losing consciousness. You know why you're here, right, Kruger? The colonel's voice was stern and admonishing. Silently, Kruger acknowledged that he would have used the same tone had he been in a superior's position. Seated behind his desk, the salt-and-pepper-haired man addressed Kruger, battered and bandaged after the tower assault. He'd been found against the door, slumped and bleeding, gashed by shrapnel. Kruger was lucky. None of his wounds were severe enough for him to be evacuated from the front lines, but some did require medical attention. He'd come to in sickbay, mumbling for Ilya. Where is she? What happened to her? The attending staff knew nothing, but shortly after Kruger became cognizant, he was summoned to face his commanding officer. When Kruger arrived at the colonel's personal quarters, he expected to be alone, to give a debrief of his operation until the point he was incapacitated. From what he could tell, the assault had ultimately been successful. Reinforcements had been able to locate and pull him out from the wreckage of that stairwell, after all. Stepping through the folds of the gaslit tent, Kruger was surprised to find Ilya already there, standing at attention opposite the colonel. The mimic's uniform was torn, slashed by various fragments launched during combat, and covered in dust and dirt. Her helmet was missing. Kruger thought her to be naked, without the goggles masking her face. Kruger. Yes, sir, he replied, snapping to attention. Answer the question. Do you know why you're here? No, sir, I do not. The colonel reclined in his chair. Your actions worry me, Kruger. Not a single problem in the past, and something like this comes straight out of the blue. You'll need to elaborate, sir. How long have you been in this division? The colonel asked. 8 years, sir. And how many mimics do you think you've seen come and go under your command? I don't know, sir. Too many to count. Of course. The colonel leaned in. Then why do you try to protect this one? The question hit Kruger like the grenade that had knocked him out. He couldn't understand why his actions in the stairwell were being subjected to scrutiny. His answer was straightforward. I wanted to keep my units in fighting condition, sir. That response didn't satisfy his commander. Is that so? Near total annihilation of your combat unit, absolute failure to accomplish tactical objectives. But this one is still here, despite all your sudden inadequacies of command. The colonel pointed a thick finger at Ilya. It debriefed me already. I know about the stairwell, and I know about your little meeting. Sir, I don't understand. The colonel sighed. I'm disappointed I have to spell this out for you. He beckoned to Ilya. L1A, come here. The mimic stepped forward and around the table, stopping next to the colonel's side. Sit. Ilya hesitated. L1A, that was an order. At those words, Ilya dropped into the colonel's lap. She hid her face from the man, instead locking eyes with Kruger's, the cold, green orbs expressing voiceless discomfort. The colonel squeezed the mimic's thigh before he, too, turned his glare to Kruger. Before the integration, all the jarheads loved mimics, found these skin jobs on every brothel off base. You know why we ended up using them too? The colonel waited briefly, but answered his own question too quickly for Kruger to respond. They were cheap. Cheaper than you. Kruger didn't remember a time fighting without mimics. He shared that memory with the war itself. Isn't there something inherently more valuable about a living being than something that's made? Don't you get it, Kruger? They're toys, dolls, fucking weapons. I don't give a damn. But you know what they're not? Kruger remained silent. Human. They're not human. They're no different from a goddamn G.I. Joe. They look real enough, fucks with the assholes on the other side real good. The colonel's grip on Ilya tightened. The man's actions were painfully visible to Kruger. He tried to stay stone-faced while the colonel's words poured from his hardened jaw. But I don't lose sleep when I send these hollow bags into the shit, Kruger. And I sure as hell don't get attached to them. The colonel removed his hand from the mimic's leg. Out. Go, he muttered in her ear. Without a word, Ilya rose and left the tent. The colonel locked eyes with Kruger as the mimic slipped through the canvas folds. If you've decided to make that one your plaything, then so be it. But I cannot have my operators be psychologically compromised. The colonel wagged his finger toward the entrance. This is your only warning. Slip up again, and that one gets wiped. Are we clear? Kruger nodded. They've got it easy, Kruger. I hope you understand that. They're here because we command them to be. It's harder for us. The colonel leaned forward. Maybe you're a stud at running a bunch of these skin jobs into the shit and bringing half of them back. Or maybe you're just fucking terrible at dying. Maybe you're still here just because you're afraid you don't know how to live outside of hell anymore. These tools were made to be thrown away. Their only dignity is in fulfilling that end. It'd be cruel to deprive them of that. Dismissed. As soon as the colonel finished his sentence, Kruger saluted and did a quick about face. Only when he was past the folds of the tent did he notice his fists were so tightly clenched his palms had turned white. He unfurled his fingers, stretching them while the blood crept back into his hands. Ilya stood no more than 10 feet from the colonel's tent. Kruger approached, and the two strode away. You told him? Ilya's eyes gazed off into the distance, not meeting his. This unit's duty is to observe and report, the actions of this unit and its direct superiors included. Ilya turned to Kruger. Was that incorrect? Kruger jammed his hands into his pockets. No, it wasn't. Fuck, I want to smash the face on that son of a bitch. Until then, Kruger hadn't noticed that Ilya's hands, too, had been balled into fists. She looked at him, expecting him to continue talking, but realized what he'd seen. Copying his earlier motion, she allowed her fists to slink into her fatigue jacket pockets. Kruger saw and chuckled. He could have sworn the mimic blushed in response. The edges of his lips, though, quickly turned downward, the fleeting smile disappearing. You're mad, too. This unit does not comprehend that emotion. But you do. You're angry. You wanted to lash out. I can see it. Kruger jumped in front of Ilya, stopping her in the middle of the soggy camp. He pointed directly to her forehead. What's going on up there? The mimic was silent. Though she turned away from him, the visible half of her face betrayed deep contemplation. Ilya's swampy eyes slowly moved back to his, cutting him, sawing into his soul with a serrated blade. This unit is conditioned to never harm a superior. She stopped, her face contorted into a grimace, clearly struggling for words. This unit did everything it could to not defy that directive. You're hurting, Ilya. This unit has no injuries that would exceed the threshold for pain in a human being. Not on the outside. His finger once again made a line to her head. Inside. You've got some conflict tearing you apart. Morals, orders, logic, behavior. They're all clashing in your head and you can't sort them out. Kruger smiled again. Goes to show there's some human hiding in there after all. The two resumed walking in silence. They'd nearly reached the middle of the encampment when Ilya spoke up again. What were the provisions of Rafferty's promise? It was silly, Kruger said, chuckling. When we got dropped between all these mountains, first thing on day one the guy says, when we're getting out of this shit, we're going to my folks' place on the ocean. No more of this fucking snow. Never shut up about it, about his home or his folks. Can't blame the guy, though. He really loved them. Kruger grew quiet, thinking for a second. I never got around to writing that letter to them either. Neither spoke until they stood at their destination. This time Kruger broke the silence. Operators can request mimics that have seen extended service be decommissioned and reassigned to civilian duties. When my rotation's up, how about I put the order in for you? I'm sure even you'd get some good out of getting away from this. We'll go to Raph's folks. Give them that letter. Ilya stared at Kruger. Her normally wooden expression had given way to one that could only be interpreted as shock. She quickly mustered up the composure to continue. Is that a promise, sir? Yeah, that's a promise. Kruger laughed, loud enough for the quartermaster on duty to glance up from his stack of pressed uniforms. How does that sound? Would you like that? I would like that very much. To that, Kruger was speechless, and he allowed the mimic to go on with her tasks alone. It was not her words that floored him, but the contortion of her lips into what was unmistakably a smile. Part 3. Halcyon and their finality. We're back, boss. Raph stared out over the mountain crest. From their perch upon the steep ridge, Kruger and Raph peered down into the dusk at the remains of the city below. It had been pulverized, smashed, blown into chips of wood and brick. The rubble that had been crushed beneath the treads of tank battalions and swept into the air as dust by whirling rotors of attack helicopters now lay in dark, oblong heaps. Kruger saw the outline of the massive communications tower standing firm above the detritus. Its dish was strewn with holes and appeared off-kilt. The structure itself had chunks of its walls hacked away by a blunt cleaver, wielded by a tremor's hand. Despite its state, the battered dish still showed signs of functionality. Not a single snowflake stuck to it. The warmth of the transmitter's pulsing radio waves defrosted the bulk of the structure. Only near the bottom did icicles accumulate as the melt ran down the gray walls to the chilly streets. Through their thermal optics, neither man could see a single enemy. The streets were quiet, without even the glow of a dying fire eking out over the distance. Kruger spoke. Took longer than I would have liked. His gaze at the skeleton city didn't waver. 3 times had the small alpine city changed hands in the seesaw of the war. If all went according to plan in the ensuing assault, it'd change again, for a 4th. Kruger hoped this time would be absolute, but for now, all he could do was wait. The enemy force lay hidden, prepared to mount a furious insurrection against the army that had gathered on the cliffs above. As their commander schemed, Kruger, Raff, and the legions of mimics stood by, gazing out at the exposed bones of the valley city. It's really gone to hell down there, Kruger continued. No kidding. For all he had forgotten, for all he had lost to the haze, there was one memory that wouldn't fade. The day had long since passed, but Kruger could recall it to perfection. Its nuclear shadow lay before him, stripped bare and charred black. The once idle serenity of the frosted chalet roofs, the once unnatural regality of the centerpiece skyscraper. Even in its current state, Kruger had little difficulty coloring what it once was. 8 years was not long enough. Kruger remembered the people, the men and women who glared icy daggers at them as their convoy barreled through the streets. Even now, Kruger had to remind himself that he didn't just leave them. They were running too. On that day, from the same perch, the two had watched as a transport helicopter took off from the sprawl of buildings. Its dark figure rose up, thundered overhead, and crested the mountaintop. The thumping of its rotor blades and the stench of combustion lingered in the air long after the craft was out of sight. In the distance, a burnt orange, heartbeat-like glow emanated a corona atop the mountain range. The haze of smoke and exhaust of an advancing enemy clouded the twilight sky. The calm of dusk stood in stark contrast to the action of the day. It had been a day of motion, in trucks, in helicopters, on foot, all in an attempt to outpace the surging intruders. They had managed to do so, it seemed, but not without sacrifice. Out beyond the horizon, 3 battalions fought to stymie the surging enemy force. Victory had been but a fantasy for them. In truth, all they had hoped to accomplish was a delay, to slow the advance just enough for support to mobilize from the interior. They struggled, beaten back through border towns and across the countryside under a maelstrom of artillery shells and half-ton bombs. With their backs to the mountains that guarded the heartland of their country, they pushed against the screaming rush of carnage. 3,000 soldiers traded their lives for time. Kruger and Raff could have been among them, but instead they had the misfortune of being ordered to cheat death and retreat. While their comrades fought, they ran, closing the gap between the encroaching front and the safety of reinforcements. Soon they found themselves summiting the mountains that had once been so far in the distance. Though they had come so far and were mere miles from their objective, the journey had left a bitter taste in the mouths of all who had made it. One last image, imprinted as Kruger's unit lifted off from the cliffs. In the distance, the pulsing incandescence flared, casting the megalith tower as a soft sundial shadow on the mountain face. Tonight was different. The last slivers of dusk turned to darkness. The flames of war didn't blaze in the distance. The cloudless night permitted a calm silence, and in the absence of artificial light, the stars shone bright above. We don't have any right to be seeing this, boss. Kruger let his binoculars hang around his neck. No, we don't. Raff rummaged through his jacket, withdrawing a crisp pack of cigarettes. How close are we, you think, to the end of this shit? Can't tell. Never can tell. Okay, say we wade through this fight without taking a bullet. They tell us we're done. We can go home next week. Then what? Raff popped out a cigarette and brought it to his lips. We go home. You okay with that? Raff's words were muffled as he lifted a match to his face behind a cupped hand. Is that even a question, Raff? Yeah, it's a question. The soldier puffed a cloud of smoke, indistinguishable in the night. Let me ask you this. How long have you been fighting? You know the answer to that, too. 8 years. You and me. Raff stood with his back to the dead city. The soft burning tip of his cigarette broke the darkness. All these years following orders, leading these things into battle? Do we even know anything else? After all this time, 8 years, and we haven't taken a single step from where we started. Kruger didn't say a word. Are we any better than them? Raff took another drag before he continued. Sometimes I wonder what you'd do if I died. If you'd even give a shit. Of course I'd give a shit. Yeah, forget it. I'm a bastard for even thinking that. An alarm blared from the center of the encampment. Kruger turned toward the sound. Dark figures shuffled in sudden commotion. I think it's time, boss. Yeah. Raph moved to retrieve his weapon. The rifle stood against a nearby rock. They slung them over their shoulders and joined the clamor. A push was made into the final bastion, the last dissenting concrete monolith, the highest of them all. As mortar fire rained down in the darkness, decisive battles were held on each floor of the structure. The mimic force surged forward while the resistance buckled in retreat, climbing higher and higher, growing thinner and thinner. From the ground to the roof, the tower squealed with the last gasps of a cornered and nearly extinguished foe. Still, combat raged throughout the night, the darkness disturbed by the occasional fiery plume flaring through a shattered window. It would all end tonight. Kruger fought his way skyward, spearheading a squad of 6 through the dimly lit building. His actions were quick, mechanical, determined. He knew any mistake in the close confines of the building's corridors could be fatal. His mimics followed close, Ilya supplanting his shadow. Near the top, the cackling laughter of gunfire dwindled, the defiant enemy on its last legs. Nevertheless, Kruger was cautious. The first assault had been brash. Little care had been taken by the ascending vanguard to confirm the security of each floor. The 6 patrolled the halls, weapon-mounted flashlights trained ahead. 1 pop, then 2, 3, more and more until the entire space became engulfed in a thunderous roar. Splinters flew, the walls disintegrating as fiberboard ceiling panels dropped and fractured, shredded in the metal tempest. Kruger ducked for cover, spinning around a corner and slamming himself into a wall. He angled his weapon back down the hall, blindly firing in the direction of the shots. 3 of his mimics followed suit, neglecting to identify a target before they pulled the triggers on their weapons. Only at the muted click of his dry firearm did Kruger glimpse the glimmering sparks and shattered glass and slivers of wood. A light bulb above him exploded, the blast drowned in the percussive sea. He felt the shards raining down, some bouncing off his helmet and down his back. The hall was now solely illuminated by their lights and muzzle flashes. Chaos swallowed them. A mimic stepped into the hallway cross, blasting a quick burst from its rifle before being hit. It tumbled backward onto the floor, absorbing another shot as it fell. Trapped in the hailstorm of lead, the wounded mimic struggled to drag itself across the ragged carpet, only to be hit again and thrown onto its back. No fewer than 10 shots pierced its body before it lay still. In the discordant bright and dim, a single thought permeated Kruger's mind. Ilya. Where's Ilya? He strained in the dark, searching for her figure. The hot, sulphurous haze of gunpowder singed his nostrils and clouded his vision. Kruger stepped away from the corner and found her, just across the hall, at the junction. Ilya's hand was outstretched, frozen, reaching out to the mimic whose body had now become but an obstruction in the hallway. As the flashes pulsed, she slid her goggles up, eyes ablaze underneath, fixated on the fallen mimic's riddled corpse. She melted. Ilya's arm fell, then her legs gave out. She dropped to her knees, her torso only propped up by the wall at her side. Amidst the chaos, Ilya curled herself away from the firing line and pressed against the wall. Clamping her weapon tight between her legs, she guarded herself. Kruger drew closer, placing his hand on the jagged corner of the intersection. Ilya. Shaking, Ilya ripped off her helmet and threw it aside. The headgear skittered across the debris-covered floor and vanished into the dark. Kruger stepped forward, into the hallway. Ilya. She thrust her back into the wall and began rocking back and forth, the rifle still clenched in both hands. Ilya cried out, eyes sealed shut, but her screams were lost in the fury. Ilya! She turned to him, green orbs flashing a light, wide, glossy, and clear. Ilya stared at Kruger, her mouth agape and her face pale, the color of snow. A mass of dull blonde hair slid in front of it. As if time stood still, that fleeting moment deadened the chaos. A calm washed over Kruger. Those eyes, even with the world disintegrating, even with the frenzied panic they betrayed, were alive. They danced and sparkled like no others Kruger had ever seen before. They were so very human. A sharp pain in his chest. A sudden twinge in his leg. Kruger crumpled, hitting the floor concurrent with a deafening detonation down the hallway. Silence settled in, muddled by boots crunching the remnants of the walls and ceiling. No more gunshots, no more explosions. It was over. No! Ilya scrambled into the intersection. She reached Kruger, on his side as he hacked up a glob of bloody mucus. Ilya. Kruger moved a lock of hair dangling in front of her shimmering eyes. Do you understand now? Get up. She labored to speak those 2 words, refusing to answer the question. You made a promise. Kruger propped himself up on his wrist. Help me. he grunted. Ilya grabbed a hold, pulling him up by his armpits. Kruger braced himself against her, one arm over her shoulder. I want to go outside. The surviving mimic stood at attention, waiting for a command that would go unsaid. They lined the hallway as Ilya led Kruger, shuffling through the splinters and fragments of shattered glass. Up to the roof. Please don't leave me. I'm not going anywhere. They climbed the stairs, bursting out onto the tower's flat roof. The silhouettes of bomber jets passed low overhead. Their whining engines pierced the silence with a droning requiem before they vanished behind the mountain range. As imposing as the tower stood, it was dwarfed by the magnificent surrounding cliffs. In the early morning, not yet dawn, the crag was but another shadow on the horizon. Here. Put me here. Ilya lowered Kruger to the ground, supporting him against a ventilation duct. She scanned his body. Half the soldier's gray fatigues had grown red and wet. His eyes gazed far, beyond the cliffs, dark irises unmoving. I'm sorry. Kruger coughed. A trickle of blood stained the corners of his lips. I won't be able to make good on my promise. Ilya stood noiseless, placid, her back to the dark sky. Did Raph say anything else before he died? Without question, without hesitation, she replied. He said he felt cold, so cold he couldn't move, like he was turning into a doll. Kruger looked skyward. I'd have to agree. A rumble echoed in the distance, and the wind gusted. Hey, Ilya. Think I've got a chance? Based on... Ilya stopped. She opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped herself before saying another word. Her eyes darted across the ground, then to Kruger. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. The dying soldier smiled. Huh. Isn't that the most beautiful view? Ilya turned toward the mountains. Kruger watched, his last image her hair, golden and fluttering graceful, bathed in the halcyon glow of the thermonuclear sunrise. You have been listening to Halcyon, a short story written, narrated, and produced by yours truly, Doug Wu. Outro music is Digital Sunset by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Special thanks to my college workshops and beta readers, and especially the wonderful Tish O'Dowd. Halcyon was a finalist in the 2019 Dream Foundry Writing Contest. If you enjoyed this story and would like to support my future work, or would like to hear my voice on the go, an audiobook version can be purchased at Kobo Writing Life, linked below. Thank you for listening.